Hi guys. So this video is a little bit different. This is obviously not the podcast, but I did have a pretty interesting conversation on Twitter today. I talked to Nick about this earlier because we talk about role playing games 24/7 basically. But I felt the need to make a longer form response to this because this got me thinking quite a bit, more broadly about GMing philosophy and role playing philosophy. Um, I am relatively new to the OSR. I came up on AD&D Second Edition back in the when I was too young to really get much out of it, for sure. And for a long time, I've been interested in coming back and doing a more old school style D&D game and seeing what are the things that have been kind of lost to time, or at least lost to the popular consciousness from older editions of D&D. And so YouTube and its algorithmic magic has been serving me up lots of OSR content. And that's, how I found Basic Expert. But today, Basic Expert posted this thread about reaction roles in these games. And while I have found a lot of interesting ideas in the OSR that I basically have been like, oh, okay, I can totally incorporate this into my games, and it totally makes sense. The reaction role is not one of them. And before we get started, I hate that I even have to say this. There's been so much fucking drama on Twitter recently. I am. This is not a takedown or anything like that. This is literally, I want to have a conversation about this. So if you guys are involved in this thread, or you just find this topic interesting and you have a YouTube channel, I'd be interested to see video responses to this, because I think that there is a longer form conversation to be had than 280 characters at a time. I actually, even prepping this video, I had some trouble finding the relevant kind of responses I wanted to go through because of the insane threading on Twitter. when you say something, everybody can respond, and then you're responding to their responses, and it's hard to even track down the relevant parts of the conversation. But the reaction role is something that I have kind of a visceral gut reaction against in a lot of circumstances. Not all. Like I said in this first response that I said to him, I said I think reaction roles make sense for a lot of random encounters, but most of the time I have a good enough idea of how my NPCs think that when the PCs are trying to persuade them, adding a random element to the reaction doesn't make much sense. And my only kind of real exposure to reaction roles in mechanics of games has been in Lion and Dragon, which I may open the PDF in a moment to look over. And I can see the use for it. Like, let me just open the PDF real quick. In this section, basically the relevant parts are here, for at least the relevant parts to this discussion. Pundit says, note that a reaction roll can be used also in the case of wild animals or monsters to determine whether in a random wilderness encounter the creature automatically attacks a PC or group of PCs. This makes sense to me. It makes sense for, encountering groups of monsters, encountering a group of bandits if this is a randomly generated event. Just getting an immediate pulse check on, what's their disposition towards the players. And cue off of that, improvise based on that. I get that. But when you're engaging in conversation with NPCs, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Because what I'm looking for out of role-playing games is maybe not what everyone else is looking for. The thing that I like out of role-playing games is the role-play itself. And no, I'm not, I did study theater, but I am not some thespian gamer. I am not one of these people who likes to, write their game as a novel and have the players play out the pre-planned adventure. By any means. No, I improvise the entire time. I essentially come up with a kind of a few scenes. For my session prep is basically coming up with a few scenes that I think are might plausibly happen in the opening of the game, coming up with hooks, and then seeing where the players go with that, which inevitably is always in directions that I didn't anticipate, and that's the fun. That's where we get the interesting experiences, because you become immersed in the game The players, in my opinion, are there basically to create a character, play their character, and stay in character as much as they can during the experience, to try to play out what this human being is, how they would act in the world as presented by the GM, within the constraints of whatever genre that you're playing in. So obviously, if you're playing in something like Lion and Dragon, your characters are not going to act remotely like they would in, a science fiction game, or something that's more gonzo fantasy, something that's going to be like more wild. That already puts constraints on how people should play, in my opinion. But my problem with the reaction role is that I don't see myself as a neutral referee in the game world as a GM. I also don't see myself, like Pundit on his stream recently was talking about how basically the game master should attempt to set in motion this be the clockwork god. You create this world, this engine that sets events in motion, and you allow this to kind of procedurally generate and simulate the world. I am much closer to that style of GMing than I am whatever it is that the new gamer, the millennial 5e crowd does. But I have a very solid sense of how NPCs act, the various characters that I am role-playing. Because as a game master, I am not simply a referee. I am also a participant in this world. I am role-playing all of the other people that they interact with, that the players interact with. And I don't know if this is just because I have a relatively high degree of empathy. I can easily put myself in the shoes of another person and think, how would this person act under this situation? But the kind of more fundamental problem I'm finding here is that these reaction roles, you're randomly determining the disposition of whoever it is. And they are very general. I understand we're not, this isn't a random table of dialogue options that are are triggered by the roles. I get that. The point is to have this general disposition and then weave that into the game and make it make sense, improvise based on it, and possibly provide some degree of the unexpected even for the GM. My problem is that introducing randomness into this, you're introducing randomness into something that is not random. Human beings do not act randomly. They do not. Their disposition is not determined randomly, to my mind. To bring in a little bit of a bit of a more autistic topic, I'm very interested in Austrian school economics. Mises, in particular, Ludwig von Mises is my hero. I have, his motto is tattooed on my arm. And in his treatise, Human Action, he opens with this line that basically says that human beings act purposefully. They engage in purposeful behavior, and they evaluate various means to achieve various ends, any given end. They're not always successful in this, but in the sense that they are choosing between various means to achieve a given end, they are acting rationally. They are ranking options, and when you choose one means to achieve an end, you are setting aside the others. This is the opportunity cost. And so even an insane person, someone whose behavior we think is ridiculous, it doesn't, it makes no sense, not something that we would consider rational in the sense of choosing the correct means. Those people aren't acting irrationally. An insane person who goes to the top of a building and believes, that they can spread their arms like wings and fly if they jump off of the building, we know that that is not a good means for doing that. But we also know that they're not acting in a random manner. They have chosen a poor means to achieve an end. Whether this is a problem of information or of their ability to process information in the world, they are still acting rationally in that sense. And so my characters, when I am role-playing the NPCs, they are not reacting randomly to the actions of the players. This adding this element of randomness into something that is fundamentally not random really doesn't jive with I don't know, anything I know about the world. This breaks the simulation for me. It takes me out, and it takes me out of the immersion. And this might be due to me having a fairly high degree of empathy. I can put myself in people's shoes very easily. I am very good at improvising. I think on my feet very quickly. But it just seems false. It just seems false to me. And the thing is, when we're rolling dice, we are drawing an arbitrary line somewhere on what we think merits a roll versus not meriting a roll. If you had a spectrum of like fully simulationist dice rolling, determining every single outcome, nobody would play that. Obviously, you're not going to roll to cross the street or to tie your shoes or to lift the fork to your mouth. It's that would be a terrible game. No one would be interested in it. And it would not be realistic or have any sense of verisimilitude, because this isn't how we exist in the world. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, we don't simply determine the outcomes of situations based on whimsy. We're not just sitting around collaboratively telling a story where we just kind of arbitrarily decide the outcomes of events. We use the dice when they are dramatically relevant, when there is a chance of success or failure that merits, by some criteria, rolling dice to decide this outcome. Obviously, I think everyone agrees combat is the perfect example of where this should be done. It adds an enormous amount of dramatic flair. It has in a sense, a neutral arbiter for the outcomes of events as modified by various probabilities, blah, blah, blah. But I don't find conversation or persuasion a situation in which you use that, except in a circumstance where you're dealing with someone who is less sentient, or maybe this is like if you have someone who's like sub 80 IQ, and they witness some horrific act that the player characters have done. They've just murdered someone, or they're in the process of robbing a bank, and some idiot sees them. Maybe that's a time for a reaction roll. Do they freeze? Do they run? Do they what is their immediate reaction? This for me, the reason that I find that would be kind of a useful circumstance for this sort of role is that the understanding of how someone's brain works like that is behind me. I can't I can't access that, But for someone who is intelligent, who has ideas, makes choices, the interesting NPCs that are going to be interacting with my player characters, who are going to be allies, antagonists, that adding the element of randomness to that, for me, it doesn't add to the realism. There's not a neutral, we're not adding a sense of kind of a neutral arbiter to this, because there isn't a neutral arbiter. The character is not neutral in this situation. The NPC rather is not neutral in this situation. So for me, in my games, I tend to also want to play with very good role players, simply because this is the goal of the game for me. This is where the fun comes from, is people being in character, immersing themselves in their characters so much that these unexpected things can happen, and you kind of lose yourself in these moments of immersion. It's what makes this whole hobby worth it, and why, in my opinion, this is kind of this unique experience that you can't get from movies or video games or anything else. And so in the same way that I would never ask the player for a reaction roll, I don't think it's appropriate for me to make a reaction roll for an NPC. You know, if they're having a conversation, if they're trying to interact with someone to persuade them or deceive them or any of this stuff, that doesn't make any sense, because I am not a neutral referee in this situation. I am also role playing. I just happen to be role playing a whole lot more people than the player characters are. And so this just doesn't do it for me. And in this thread, there were some interesting things said. I can kind of go down. I think I found the relevant ones. And again, this is all qualified. Expert says, old school editions state they're not to be used for everything. If a GM has a good idea of how an NPC would react, then there's no need for the roll. For instance, the party comes across its bitter enemy. Yeah, agreed. Except my thing is, I think I have a strong enough grasp on the NPCs that I'm playing that I always have a good idea of how they would react. And it's not simply that they're all going to react in the same way. That would be not only incredibly boring, but that's not how I think about the world. These are different people with different motivations, different dispositions. I generally have an idea of, what were they doing right before the characters arrived? So this isn't something that I feel the need to actually make a roll for. And for me, adding the roll, not only does it not make sense in the sense that I also wouldn't ask the players for a reaction roll, be like, well, what's your disposition to this? They just know, they tell me. But the problem is that adding a roll, if I already have a good idea of what their disposition is, which I do almost all of the time, adding a roll on top of that is just adding another thing that I have to keep in my mind and deal with. So there is, we got down to a point, he says the mechanics are a tool for improvising, though. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than me rolling dice, looking at a table, and improvising how that makes sense. Once I figure that out, if it's an NPC, I role play the result, etc. And I said, for my games, this seems like improvising with extra steps. I think this is a case of your mileage may vary with a mechanic like this. So I don't find that rolling like this actually takes any of the load off of me. It actually makes it so I have to shoehorn in why a character would react in a potentially very unrealistic manner to NPC, to a conversation. It is, and it disrupts. Anytime you're rolling dice, it is disrupting the flow of the game. And you have to roll dice in these games. These are the means by which, I said previously, we are adjudicating these disputes in a somewhat neutral manner. We're not just arbitrarily deciding the outcomes of these things. But every time you're rolling the dice, it does interrupt the flow of the game. And if we are role playing, my expectation is that my players are going to role play, and their expectation is that I am going to role play. And if we're constantly interfering with that flow, we are disrupting the immersive nature of the experience. And he says, again, the roll is a prompt. Otherwise, you'll always lean into your biases. I use random rolls to branch out and challenge my habits. You have to truly adapt and stretch yourself as a GM, I find, with this way. Sort of. Like, I do get what he's saying here. And I think that there's a context for a way that I can use this, not with reaction rolls, though, with like the use of random tables for generating events in the world that the players are not present for. They pass through a town, they complete a quest, and when they come back, the town, something has happened. Something is different. And if you have good random tables, this can add enormous amounts of unpredictable creativity to your game. Believe me, I completely get that. And this is something that I haven't really used in my games previously, and I will be using going forward. Also, generating the structure, like best random tables I've seen in any game, bar none. It's in Cults of Chaos for Lion and Dragon. I mean, it has tables for generating the structures of various cults. This is absolutely fuel for great games, great adventures. I get all of that. But using a reaction roll for individuals I have this gut, this massive gut reaction. It's not revulsion, but it is a massive rejection of this as it doesn't make sense. Maybe for crowds, finding the disposition of crowds when you're simulating, hundreds of people. Obviously, I can't keep in my mind, the individual minds of hundreds of people. That might be a situation where you're simulating a mob, something that is actually sort of is much more mindless in nature than an individual. But if I am simulating an individual, if I'm role playing an individual, I find that bringing an element of randomness into this goes against the very nature of what I know of how human beings act. So it really doesn't jive with me. So I think that's all I have to say on this. I might have missed some points I was thinking about previously, but I find this, it's not even a crutch. I don't think that this is a crutch that people are using, because I think that this, honestly, at least for me, this would not aid me. This would hinder me. It's more like like, I don't know, tying one arm behind my back or tying a leg behind my back so I can't walk properly. This is a stumbling block to authentic role play, in my opinion. And again, in Lion and Dragon, the last part of this page is a final note. He says, note that the reactions in the reaction table are broad outlines. The GM should feel free to interpret them how he feels based on the vagaries of the particular situation. All reaction checks are deeply dependent not only on the circumstances of the environment, but also the quality of the role-playing done by the player in his expression of what his character is attempting to do and how his character acts. So what's the point of the roll then, in my opinion? Because this is how you role-play. Is, as a GM, I am reacting to the player. The player is reacting to the NPC. They are role-playing their character in reaction to whatever the NPC is saying. And the NPC is reacting in relation to what the player character is doing. And so I find that I am generally very picky about my players, because I want strong role players who are there and committed to role-playing effectively and authentically, and trying to be in the moment and create the conditions that lead to these moments of immersion. And so exactly what I said earlier, I would never ask the player to make a reaction roll in this sense, unless there was some, like magical ability that is being used, impressed upon them, in that case, making a savings throw or some sort of resistance check against an unnatural force being applied to them. That would be a circumstance in which to roll. Or if they were attempting to do that to an NPC, that would require a roll in my mind. But if we are role playing together and simulating this world together, and it just, as the GM, I am simulating the everything that is not them. The reaction roll seems more like a hindrance. It seems more like a distraction, and more like a way of killing the authenticity of the experience. So I think that's about it. Like I said, I think that there is a lot coming out of the kind of OSR content that I'm getting that I am finding very interesting. The use of random tables, I think, is the effectiveness of using them is highly dependent on the quality of the tables, because I've seen a lot of random tables in my time as a gamer, and most of them are super boring. Like, rolling 2d10, and it's like, okay, there's orcs. It's like, okay, I have no interest in that. That is not that that is adding nothing to the game for me, because the game is driven by the players interacting with things, and I don't know. I'm getting a little off track here. But I think that's basically it. Yeah, it's just that human beings engage in purposeful behavior. They have goals, motivations, and I already have a very good sense of what those goals and motivations are, and influencing influencing the disposition of the characters in an arbitrary way based on this die roll, that is immersion breaking for me. So I'm interested to hear if you guys have any thoughts on this, where I'm way off base, if I'm off base, if I'm just using reaction rolls wrong. I'm not using them yet. I will be using them in my game of Lion and Dragon coming up, because I do want to attempt to play this as written. But I have a deep-seated aversion to this. And again, for me, it comes down to this. All of this, comes down to the vagaries of the particular situation. That is everything. That is the root of how I run my games. I have the vagaries of the situation in my mind already. I know how the world functions. It just doesn't make sense to interfere with that process, because that is what this seems like. So anyway, that's about it. I'm rambling now. If you guys have something to say, please let me know. Tell me I'm wrong. Let me know in the insult section, as Mr. Max calls it. And yeah, hope to hear from you guys. All right, that's it.